All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Soviet space program. In the early years of the space race, the Soviet Union was actually ahead of the United States. They built a good rocket before we did. They launched the first satellite called Sputnik 1 in 1957. Okay, this is a picture of Sputnik 1. It's really not much bigger than a basketball, but it was a working satellite. As it orbited the Earth, it broadcast a radio signal, and people could hear that even in the United States. And it really shook people up, especially in the United States, that the Soviet Union had a satellite that was going over our country, every 90 minutes, and you could hear it on the radio. And so that really caused people to think, hey, we need to catch up with these guys. We need to focus on science so our country can do the things they do. All right, so the United States finally launched the satellite about a year later in 1958. All right. Soviet Union also launched the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. This is him right here on a spacecraft called Vostok 1. And he actually orbited the Earth one time and before he landed. And that was a huge deal. All right. It took the United States another month to get a human into space, and he didn't even orbit. Okay, it took the United States another whole year to get a human to orbit the Earth. So, at first the Soviets were really ahead of us, and it scared a lot of people in this country that, the Soviet Union, who were essentially our enemies, were way ahead of us in the space race, or so it seemed. Okay. They had some more firsts. They launched the first woman in space in 1963. United States didn't launch a woman into space until the space shuttle like 20 years later. All right. They had the first spacewalk, and a spacewalk is where an astronaut in a spacesuit actually leaves the spacecraft. They launched the first interplanetary probe, which means a probe to a planet. They had this first space rover, I believe that landed on the moon, and they had the first space station. All right. But then in the later 1960s, when we were getting ready to launch the United States was getting ready to launch astronauts to the moon, the Soviet had a moon landing program also, but it failed. They were testing a very large rocket to launch their spacecraft to the moon, and that rocket failed numerous times, and they never were able to get it to launch, and so they basically had to cancel their program to land people on the moon. And so after the failure of their moon landing program, they focused on building space stations instead and staying in Earth orbit. Just a couple of interesting facts. Their astronauts aren't called astronauts, they're called cosmonauts. And they still have a space program, even though it's not the Soviet Union, it's called Russia now. And NASA astronauts, as of right now, have to take Russian spacecraft to the space station, because after the space shuttle was retired, right now the United States has no way to launch astronauts, so they're riding Russian rockets in space. Alright, let's talk about NASA, the United States Space Program. Okay, it was formed in 1958 by President Eisenhower. NASA stands for National Air and Space Administration. That's what the NASA stands for. Okay. It was formed so our space program could be run by civilians, which are people that are not military people. All right. At first, the rockets and satellites that we were building were essentially missiles that were used for military purposes, and our country, especially our President Eisenhower, thought, we need to make sure that non-military people are in charge of our space program. It would, it makes it's better publicity for the public. So we formed NASA. and NASA has been responsible for all United States unmanned and manned space exploration since 1958. Alright, the first program at NASA for launching a satellite into orbit was called the Explorer program. And you'll see here that NASA has their programs have names. Explorer was the first one. It started in 1958, and there are still Explorer satellites in orbit around Earth today. The first United States satellite was called Explorer 1, and it was launched in 1958. And here's a picture of the Explorer 1 satellite. Notice it looks a little different than the first Russian satellite, which was Sputnik. Theirs was a little round ball. Ours was shaped more a little bit like a rocket. And it was launched on top of this rocket right here. In fact, this satellite is way up here at the top of that rocket. So most of this rocket is nothing but fuel to get it up into space, and that's the satellite at the top. Some interesting facts about Explorer satellites. They discovered the shape of Earth's gravity field, the magnetosphere, which is the magnetic field of Earth. They've found a high amount of solar radiation in space, and micrometeorites, which are tiny meteorites that are in orbit around Earth. And the Explorer program is still going on with NASA today. Alright, Project Mercury. Alright, Project Mercury from 1961 through 1963 was NASA's first human space program. Alright, so this is when we start launching astronauts into space. Alan Shepard, this guy right here, was the first man American in space in 1961 in a Mercury spacecraft. Okay, this right here is a Mercury spacecraft. Here it is on top of a rocket, and he was the first American in space, 1961. And the first two people in space, Alan Shepard was the first one. The first two, they didn't actually go into orbit around Earth. Okay, their spacecraft went up into space when they were launched, and then they came right back down. They had no way to stay in orbit. They didn't have enough speed on their first two rockets to get into space. So all they did was go up and go down, and they were only in space for just a few minutes. But hey, they got there. They were in space, and they went up and they came down. And these little spacecraft, once they came down out of space, some parachutes popped open, and it landed in the ocean, and they were rescued by a ship. Alright. Then John Glenn, the third American in space, was actually the first one to orbit Earth in 1962 in a Mercury spacecraft. So he had a bigger rocket that he was launched on, and he made it all the way into orbit. And if I remember correctly, he did 3 orbits of Earth, and then he came down, and again, his spacecraft was the same as the first two. When it came down, some parachutes pop out, and it entered the Earth atmosphere, and it slowed down and landed in the ocean. A total of 6 astronauts were launched in the Mercury spacecraft from 1961 to 1963. Alright, so our first 7 astronauts, 6 of them actually got to go into space on Mercury spacecraft. And it might be interesting, the name Mercury, obviously Mercury is our first planet, and this was our first human spacecraft, so they named it after Mercury. Alright. In 1962, President Kennedy, this man right here, made a very famous speech in which he challenged the nation to go to the moon in this decade. And the decade he was talking about was the 1960s. This meant he wanted Americans to go to the moon before 1970. Alright? It was a very famous speech, and this speech helped President Kennedy get Congress to approve a greatly increased funding for NASA. So basically, you have to ask Congress for money to run NASA, and this speech helped Mr. Kennedy get extra money for NASA. And NASA accepted the challenge and immediately began to work on a mission to the moon, to send people to the moon. And if it hadn't been for that speech, it might have taken much longer for the United States to get people to go to the moon.